Paula Kosin is a author, speaker, consultant, career coach, certified grief educator, and licensed clinical professional counselor. Her new book is titled Grieving, a Spiritual Process for Catholics. Paula Kosin, welcome to Catholic Forum.
Thank you. Good to be here, Bob.
We're going to be talking about this great book, and you know, grieving is something that unless you're a psychopath or whatever, I mean, everybody goes through grieving at some point in their life. So I think it's a universal problem. So we're going to be talking about your great book in a moment. But before we do, tell us a little bit about yourself, if you would, please.
Oh, a little bit about myself. Grew up in the Chicago area, went through Catholic schools to the high school. And I think that part of what characterizes my experience growing up was the part that's in the dedication to my book, which is it's to my father, which in his last week that he was with us, in grace and good humor, he told us, "My bags are packed and I've got a date with your mother."
Huh.
And that's how, I mean, he had a rock solid faith and he knew where he was going. And so that's the kind of home that I grew up in. I also was very much impacted even as a kid for Vatican II, and just the refreshing way that the church was opening itself to the world. Certainly social justice issues
Mhm.
were important. And I always had a sense of vocation, and I don't know where it came from, but it was that I felt kind of responsible for discovering, developing my gifts, and using them to build a kingdom, if I would be saying that to a religious audience, or make the world a better place. And so I
Mhm.
had that sense with me early on. Was always interested in counseling. I initially in my career went into residence hall work at Syracuse University, and so I worked with college students. Then I had a long career in human resources, mostly in corporate training and development. Had my own consulting practice where I was a career coach for many, probably over 1,000 clients who had been terminated from their jobs, had been downsized. And so saw a lot of grief right there. But also, I grew up in a family that was a huge extended family. My parents were both one of eight. And so, if you do the math, which I'm not really a favorite of, but if I do the simple math, I had 28 aunts and uncles, and then I had cousins on top of that, and they were all in the same couple of southwest suburbs of Chicago. So, we grew up in our family as kids, going to wakes and funerals, and that's how I observed initial grief. But beyond a wake and a funeral, there really wasn't a lot to observe.
Mhm.
I wasn't aware of that. So it was only as an adult that I become much more aware of the whole grieving process.
Did you realize at the time when you were counseling folks who just lost their job that dealing with that grief would ultimately help you in your future endeavors dealing with people who've lost loved ones?
Oh, of
In
course not.
Yeah, yeah, right.
I think it was just, I was drawn to wanting to help them.
Mhm.
And not only in some ways emotionally, although I was not counseling them, but not only a support emotionally for helping them through that, but also with the things like writing a resume and how to interview and kind
Right.
of the nuts and bolts of job search.
Yeah.
But no, I did not know. I did read Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's classic book on death and dying when I was a young adult, and I was interested in it, but it was sort of like in the back of my head. Not that I would ever do anything. I just found it very interesting. So it's not surprising to me that later in life I was drawn to become a hospice volunteer, to learn how to facilitate discussions with advanced care planning,
Hmm.
and then certainly working with grief support groups.
Hmm. Was it witnessing your father's passing and his bravery and his spirit and his faith? Was that what kind of triggered you into this area?
That really was, it made a huge impression on me. My mother had passed away in 2005. And she had had Parkinson's, dementia, and was and then had a fall and a traumatic brain injury. So that was one prominent experience of dying and death, because after her fall, she actually lived for another 4 years with a wonderful caregiver at my dad's house. So that was one experience. My older brother passed away in 2009 of kidney cancer when he was only 59. And then in 2011 is when my father passed away. And I think that his attitude during that entire week was really a witness for everybody in the family, because lots of people went over to visit him, for the last time. And I think he had that impact on a lot of people.
So, how did your book, Grieving, a Spiritual Process for Catholics, come about?
Well, I can't take a whole lot of credit because the opportunity really fell in my lap. And as I think I said in my acknowledgments, when something like this opportunity falls in your lap, you don't say no to God and the Holy Spirit. You have to do it. I was actually, it was an editor that came to talk to the director of pastoral care at my parish, and she said, "We're looking for someone to write a book on grieving, and we'd like you to consider that." And the director just kind of chuckled at her, and she says, "You don't need to be talking to me. You need to be talking to Paula." And so that's how I got hooked up with liturgy training publications. And people know liturgy training publications because a lot of times the lectors at a parish will have the readings for the year that come out in a book that liturgy training publications, or LTP, puts out. They do marriage prep and baptism prep and all kinds of things for parishes. And so this was a new area for them to move into, to do this book. And then there are two others related to grieving. So it fell in my lap totally. I can't take any responsibility, but it was a responsibility and a heavy decision to say, this book can have a huge impact, and am I up to that?
Yeah. Is the book actually more for an individual, or is it for a group, a parish who wants to start a grieving ministry, or is it all of the above?
It's actually all of the above and more, because it's the publisher wanted to have it serve two purposes. They wanted it to be a supplement to the a grief support group. And so the book itself is based on the grief support model that I developed and have done at St. Thomas. There's actually 3 books on grief and bereavement that the publisher has put out. The other one is Forming a Parish Bereavement Ministry. And I wrote, excuse me, I wrote a chapter that is setting up and facilitating a grief support group for that book. So my book is designed to go along with those 7 sessions, but it's also designed as a book that an independent person can pick up, and they don't feel like they're picking up like a workbook to a grief support group. And so it served 2 purposes, and it really is for people who are in grief, and it's helpful to know what can I expect, although it's not definite, but the different things that are going on. Am I going crazy, or is this okay and natural? It also, so it's for the griever themselves. It's for anyone who wants to support somebody who is grieving, to learn how to support them best. And then it also is for anybody who is particularly in roles or jobs. And I think of this could be a book that could be given to all first responders, the police department. I mean, in Chicago and all the cities, there's so many shootings and even suicides in the ranks. So fire department, first responders of all kinds, nurses, doctors and medical personnel, hospice. There's just, a wide variety of people that could benefit greatly from the grief education that is in this book, whether they're Catholic or not.
Yeah.
Actually,
do people of faith grieve differently from people who have no faith?
The answer is yes, and even people of faith grieve differently from each other,
Well, that's
because
true. Yeah.
everybody's very unique.
Yeah.
But what the research says, which is really interesting, what the research says is that people who have a strong faith or strong religious beliefs have an easier time navigating grief, and they go through it a little bit quicker, so they
Hmm.
resolve it more completely. Even people with what they call in the research, they call a low level of faith or beliefs, come through it better than someone with no beliefs. But people with no beliefs at all or no religious affiliation, often their sense of meaning comes not from their spirituality or their religious beliefs, but it comes from kind of a science angle, and an appreciation that there is a force of some kind behind nature and everything in our world,
Hmm.
and they just don't call it God like we might call it God.
My guest today on Catholic Forum is Paula Cosin. The book is titled Grieving, a Spiritual Process for Catholics. Why is a spiritual process important?
Well, it's important because, and again, I'll go back to research. I mean, I could tell anecdotes, but I think the research is always helpful to know,
Right.
which is when you have a spirituality and you are in grief, it, as I said, it helps you navigate, especially the acute, immediate period of grief, um, more easily. And it actually, from the research, they say that it um, it increases well-being. It increases a better sense of health. It also gives a person a sense of control. They know that if you have religious beliefs, you usually know that God is in control. Somebody else is in control. Somehow this is part of the plan, and we don't often know that.
Hmm.
And it may be a long range plan. So, not that God wishes anybody to pass away and create that situation, but that's part of life and death and being human. And so it's just interesting to see that there are some mental health and actually physical health benefits from having a spiritual process and not just knowing the grief education part that anybody can learn.
Hmm. So walk us through the book. When someone picks up your book,
Mhm.
what will they see?
So the book, it rolls out basically the way I have presented the 6 sessions or 7 sessions of my grief support group. And so it starts out with the first chapter is really an invitation, a gentle invitation, so that people are welcomed in wherever they are with their spirituality, um, and to use this book as a companion in their walk of grief. And then it goes on to talking about addressing some of the misperceptions or the misunderstandings about grief, mourning, and bereavement, and what are the differences between those three. It gives some insights about love and life and the healing process, which again addresses some of the misunderstandings. I also have a chapter on the different models or patterns of grieving. Although the research continues to evolve, there is no one method or whatever model to use. So I give an introduction, and then I have a great resource center section at the end of the book that has a lot of these resources if somebody wants to investigate them more. Then there's a chapter on emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual experiences during grief. So, kind of what they might expect. There's 4 key healing practices, which include journaling, mindfulness meditation, sacraments prayer, and contemplative prayer, and nature, being out in nature. I talk about changes in relationships, again, what to expect, coping and healing activities as people work through their grief and they're ready to start engaging with the world and with life again. And then ways to handle grief on all kinds of holidays. And then there's a conclusion, and there's actually a memorial service that we do on the last session of the grief group that actually people have used at a Thanksgiving or a Christmas dinner. to be able to honor the person, the loved one who's died. So very practical,
Yeah.
and certainly so gently spiritual that I think it can also be used as kind of an evangelization tool, because I've had people in my grief groups who will come up to me privately and say, I haven't been to Mass in years, or it's been a long time. And I just say, hey, welcome in. So
Mm-hmm.
that's what I wanted the tone of the book to be.
Interesting. You mentioned that the book talks about the difference between grief, mourning, and bereavement.
Hmm.
I just thought they were all just different names for the same thing, but they're
Yeah.
different, right?
They are, and the grief is really your internal experiences. So it's the thoughts and the feelings and the beliefs that somebody has after the death of a loved one. Then mourning is actually the external manifestations of that grief. And in the olden days, women used to wear black, and sometimes the men wore black armbands
Mm.
to signal to the outside world that they are in mourning. We just don't have that anymore. And so now the kinds of mourning experiences that we usually take part in might be the massive remembrance at All Souls Day.
Mm-hmm.
It might be certainly in the Hispanic community, the Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, and the celebrations and of their ancestors, and building of altars or ofrendas in their homes or in their neighborhoods to celebrate their connection to those who have gone before them. So there are the Filipino population, from their culture, a lot of times they will say rosaries a certain number of days or have novena. So there are other ways that we mourn. And then the bereavement is just an overall kind of umbrella term that talks about um, the time period after someone has died. And of course, employers define bereavement leave as, like, if you're lucky, 3 to 5 days, and it has to be a close relative.
Right.
So that's not how I like to define bereavement. It's really that entire time.
Yeah. So, if someone loses a loved one, everybody handles that situation differently, as you mentioned. When is it time for someone to realize, okay, I need professional help? I'm not handling this on my own. What are some of those signs?
Hmm. Well, the good news is, again, going back to the research, because those are the experts. And so, what's interesting is that pretty much 2/3 of people who have gone through a grief experience, who have lost a loved one, will in fact navigate grief pretty well on their own. And so that gives people hope. But there are some people, there is probably 10% or less, that hit some brick walls basically in how they're handling grief. There are certain kinds of, and I talk about certain kinds of signs for concern that you can look for, that might be someone's personal hygiene is not where it should be. They're not keeping up the house. Maybe they're not eating enough. Maybe they're eating too much. Maybe they're eating too much junk food. Maybe they've had a car accident or two, even a
Mm-hmm.
fender bender because they're distracted. So there's a number of those kinds of signs that are signs of concern. And then the next step is either to ask sometimes friends or family members for referrals to a mental health professional. The first stop, though, I would say, is go to your medical provider, whether it's a doctor, a physician assistant, or a nurse practitioner, and get checked out physically so that they can clear you on that. And then look for a mental health professional, a licensed counselor, a licensed social worker, licensed or licensed psychologist, and check them out that way. But that's the direction I would recommend.
Mm. Should parishes be offering support groups for those parishioners who are grieving?
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
however, however, what they should be doing, and what we are responsible for doing, basically, is ministering to those who both are dying, but also those who are grieving. And so parishes can do that in a variety of ways. They can do one on one meetings with people, they can do individual phone calls. notes or cards during certain times of the year or on the anniversary of a person's, family member's death. So they can minister in a lot of different ways. Not all parishes, as you know, are big enough to support a grief support group.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just say buddy up with the other parishes in the area, because sometimes there are people that don't want to go to a grief support group at their own church, but will go to another parish.
Mm-hmm.
So some people like the fact that they can go to their own parish. Other people like to go, so they're a little bit more anonymous, I guess, and maybe not known.
Mm-hmm.
But the grief support groups are fabulous in that they create a synergy. And when I do the evaluations at the end of each of my programs, basically, so they've been together for about 2 months, 6 sessions. The thing that's most valuable to them is what they learned, the stories they heard from everybody else in the group, and what they learned from each other with some coping mechanisms and how to be able to heal, and just sharing their story. So, all the handouts, all the, the facilitator, the journaling, and some of the other things we do, the thing that always comes out on top is the fact that they appreciate being in that group. And we're supposed to be connected, and it's a good way to minister to each other.
Now, the title of your book is Grieving, a Spiritual Process for Catholics,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also would be fine for someone who's not a Catholic as well, correct?
I love that question, because as I was, finishing it and reading it, I thought this book is not, it may say Catholics, but it could be for any Christian, certainly. And really, the grief education parts of the book are excellent for anybody. If they want to just, if they're not Catholic or Christian, they can skip over the spiritual parts of the book. There's good, solid, credible grief education in it that's grounded in the current research and current best practices in healing. So,
Mm-hmm.
and in fact, one of the reviewers for my book, a journalist who has done over 200 book reviews, so I appreciate his expert opinion, actually said that. He said, this book is not just for Catholics or Christians. It can be for anybody who's looking for help themselves in healing from grief and understanding what they're going through, as well as if they're looking to support somebody in some very healthy ways.
Paula, I think we could go on talking all day, but unfortunately we're out of time. How can our listeners get a copy of your book?
Well, the book can be ordered from the publisher, Liturgy Training Publications, and it's ltp.org. But it also is on Amazon, so they can do both. LTP is the one that usually handles bulk orders from parishes that want to use it, or hospitals, or hospices who want to order in large quantities.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how they would find it.
Perfect. Well, very good. Paula Kosin, the book is titled Grieving, a Spiritual Process for Catholics. Thanks for joining us today on Catholic Forum. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.